So, yes, good evening, everyone. And again, thank you for joining us at the Economic Research Council for this important discussion on the UK budget and tax policy. Very warm welcome to today's session. It's a real privilege to introduce Professor Judith Freedman. We're really delighted that she could join us here today to discuss crucial issues around the creation of tax policy. If you're not aware, Judith is an emeritus professor of taxation law and policy at the University of Oxford. She was the inaugural professor of taxation law at Oxford from 2001 to 2019 and played a pivotal role in establishing the Oxford University Centre for Business Taxation. She brings a wealth of knowledge on taxation policy and design and tax avoidance and the interaction between law and accounting. And she's served on a number of numerous influential government and advisory committees, including the former Office for Tax Simplification, which should provide very useful here, obviously. As usual, Judith will speak for roughly 30 minutes, followed by a 30-minute Q&A session. And again, as usual, we really encourage you to actively participate. Please feel free to submit any questions that you have throughout the course of our discussion using the Q&A function just at the bottom of the screen. And we'll collect these and address as many of them as we can in the Q&A session later. Okay, so it's with great anticipation that I welcome Judith to share all of her valuable insights. Thank you, Judith.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for inviting me. I am amazed anyone tuned into this because I think a lot of people must be very bored by now with the budget. But I do assure you that this is not a budget talk or not the same budget talk as you've heard before. I'm not going to try to replicate what the wonderful IFS or the Resolution Foundation or any of them have done. I'm not going to use slides because I'm really not going to talk about figures very much. I'm just going to try to think about what we're doing with budgets, why they are going so badly wrong, and what we could do to improve the way we make tax policy. And I'm talking from my perspective as a lawyer, so I am more interested in processes and institutions than economists might be, but I have done a lot of work in the past with economists, and so I do seriously believe in figures. It's not that I don't believe in figures, but I just want a different perspective at this point. So this is not the budget talk. And I think one of the problems is that we do have so much information and we do have so much discussion and we do have so many pretty charts that we manage to get ourselves dragged down a rabbit hole because we start to talk about how much tax a certain provision will be bringing in. And then we start to argue about whether it will bring in that much tax and so on. And we forget about the overall design. So the big thing that I'm going to say about this past budget is that it completely lacks any sense of vision or looking to the future. And I'm not the only one who said that. Paul Johnson of the IFS has also remarked on the lack of vision in this budget. It is very disappointing and it is very worrying, given that this is the start of a new term, which promises to be stable, and there would have been an opportunity in this past budget to do something more forward-looking. I do think we get mesmerized by these charts, and I do think we have been mesmerized by the press and by others by this idea that every expenditure that government proposes has to have a matching revenue change, so that we have to match somehow, as you would with a household budget, everything you propose to spend with a source. This isn't how governments really pay for things, and it has become very foolish because we then get dragged down this route of, or this hole of saying, will this or will this not pay for this thing that we're going to do? And if we turn out not to be bringing in enough money from the new tax or the removal of the exemption or whatever, we will then have questioned whether we can do the things that we had promised to do. It simply isn't the way that budget should work, and it certainly isn't the way we should be thinking about how we design the tax system, which should be far more holistic. And it is not a painting by numbers exercise. We're not supposed to be just looking at numbers here and there. We should be looking at the design as a whole. So I think we've gone badly wrong in the way that we've been looking at this, and that's partly because of the way politicians have egged each other on to make promises. And we all know that the promises that were made this time round have seriously tied the hands of the Chancellor and meant that she couldn't do what was sensible and had to do things that really, I think most people would agree, were not the best things to do. And this is not the first time this has happened. We've had this happen in the past as well. So everything I say, and I will be using the current budget, the most recent budget as an example, but everything I'm saying really applies to all budgets, I think, since about 1984. For most of my career, which is a long career, I would have been saying the same thing. So this is not a party political exercise. This is a general set of points about how we make budgets. And it just so happens I'm using the most recent budget as an example because people will know about that. Now, of course, you do have to make promises before an election because you need to win, but it is particularly disappointing to hear Rachel Reeves most recently saying that this will be the last of the big tax changes and she's not going to make any more tax changes during the course of this Parliament because although we may not want to see big tax rises, it is actually quite difficult to do structural tax reforms without tax rises for some people. There will always be winners and losers. And so making a promise like that really has not just tied one hand behind her back, but she's now tied both hands behind her back. And I think this is very unfortunate and worrying. So I'm arguing here that we're in danger of not seeing the wood for the trees. I'm arguing that we lack overall vision as a country, so it is not just an attack on one party, that we continually fiddle around the edges with our tax system, and that we really need to start thinking about what the world is going to look like in 20 years' time. This may be beyond the time when I'm interested in tax. I will be knitting or playing bridge or something, but it will be important, and yet we don't seem to be thinking about it. Why is it so difficult to get this right? Why is it so contentious? Why can't we have a plan? Why are we finding this so hard? And what should be our overriding principles? And what processes could we use to improve the way we're doing this? So we have this government with a mandate for the next few years, and this would have been a wonderful opportunity to set out a vision. We have not seen that vision. Perhaps tomorrow evening in the Mansion House speech, we shall see a vision, but I don't think it's going to include tax from what we've heard. We have a very fast changing landscape. We have a great need for investment and for productivity and for growth. We are seeing a massive move towards automation and AI more and more, and this will decrease the employment base. So a change to taxation that increases the importance of employment is a concern to me. We also have new ways of working with the gig economy. Also, that's moving in the opposite direction. At the same time, the government is trying to increase the rights of employees with its flagship employment bill. More and more women are working, and they need to do so for financial reasons, and the benefit system often requires them to work, and yet we don't have a clear childcare system. We have climate change. We're trying to move to net zero. We have inequality, or at least perceptions of inequality. We have no sensible way of taxing land value, increases in land value. We have an aging population, of which I am one. Baby boomers are retiring. I'm refusing, but everyone else is retiring. We are hopefully living longer, but not necessarily in a more healthy way. Many of us are wealthy, the elderly, but some of us are not. And social care provision is not giving us any confidence at all. And capital taxation is really confused. And as I say, that we have not found a way to capture the value of land. So all of those things are the background. So what do? We have a budget that has very few changes that bring in a lot of revenue. The only change that brings in a lot of revenue is the national insurance change, which is a tax on employers. But and I'm not going to get into the whole question of who's really bearing the burden or the incidence of that too much, but it's quite clear that somebody has to pay it, and it is going to increase the cost of employment. So eventually that is going to have an impact on how many people are employed. And we've already seen plenty of reaction in that direction. It makes it more expensive to employ people. So there's a big incentive to use self-employed people. And we already had an incentive in the system to do, in the tax system, to do that. And at the same time, labor law, employment law is going in the opposite direction and trying to improve the rights of employees. But that's also very expensive, as is the minimum wage. So everything is going in one direction to push employers to do anything they can to cut employment. And tax is coming in and doing the same thing. That seems a very strange thing to do, given the objectives of this government to improve employment and to increase productivity and so on. Although maybe there's a hidden agenda of having fewer lower paid workers, but it's hard to see that that's part of the overall plan of this government. We've seen other things that are very small, actually, and are not going to bring in very much money at all, but are making a tremendous amount of fuss. The reduction in agricultural property relief for inheritance tax, the reduction in business profits in business relief for inheritance tax, a very slight increase in capital gains tax, which investors are pretty happy about because they thought it was going to be greater. There are good reasons for it not being greater, but it doesn't bring in a whole lot of money. Lots of small and complicated changes, which altogether are quite unpopular, costing a lot of political capital, but not bringing in very much money, and don't seem to be part of a bigger overhaul of any of these taxes. So increasing the tax, national insurance. I call national insurance a tax because national insurance is a tax. We have seen recent references to it being part of a contributory scheme. We have seen recent references to it being fine to increase national insurance payments because other countries have higher social security payments, so we're only coming into line with those other countries. But our system is very different from those of other countries, so that comparison may be somewhat spurious. Why are we doing this? Because we were trapped into doing it, because it was the only way that the Chancellor could bring in enough money. And even then, although the headline is that it's bringing in 25 billion, it probably is going to bring in about 16 billion. And by the time that they've had to put more money into the NHS and into other public services to cover this cost, and other groups will also be arguing to have help to cover the cost, it may be even less than that. It doesn't seem to have been thought through together with other policies. So point number one is tax is part of a wider system. First of all, each tax is part of a bigger tax system, and then the whole tax system is part of the legal system and our regulatory system. And we need to think of all these moving pieces together, not just tweak one, because that will have an impact elsewhere. And it worries me that that doesn't seem to be what we've done. We've said we need 25 billion pounds. This is a way we can get it. Let's do it, without thinking about all those things. So we need to think better about how all these policies fit together. Another example is fuel taxation. We have frozen that again. We have frozen that since 2011, at the same time as arguing that we're going to do something about net zero, and that we are trying to do our best for the climate. No one is thinking about what's going to replace fuel tax once we have many more electric vehicles. No one's thinking about these things, or maybe they are thinking about them, but they're not telling us what they're thinking. And that continuing freeze was very strange, and yet the amount for ending that freeze is written into the budget for the future. So if not now, when? When could we possibly do this if we didn't do it in the circumstances of this budget, when everyone agrees there's a crisis, when everyone agrees as a whole, and when there's 5 years to go before an election? It's really hard to think when we can ever do that. And there has been no mention of what we're doing about the council tax. So not even a consultation, not even any proposals about changing council tax, which is clearly under major strain. Councils are going bankrupt. There's a big disparity between what people are paying in different parts of the country. There's a perception that it's very, very unfair, but not even a mention of it in the budget. So this is why I think this is government's painting by numbers instead of looking at the whole picture, and it's not working, and we're getting blotches rather than a picture, and it's very disappointing. And we can say that there are political imperatives that have made us reach this, but we need to break that. We need to break that impasse, because we can't carry on that way. And we've been saying that, as I said, for a very long time, and there's nothing new in one sense, but in another sense, some of these systems have really reached breaking point, like the council tax system and our social care system. So we can't look at tax and not look at welfare systems and social care in particular, which we have just parked. And we had an expert commission, and we had the Andrew Dilnot report on social care, and nothing has happened. That's all been parked. So although there are people who say, well, the answer is to have a royal commission on taxation, and some serious writing has been done on that, I cannot see that any point in having a royal commission full of experts, stuffed full of people like the people from the IFS and the Resolution Foundation and ERC and me, coming up with great plans, which are then just going to be parked. So I'm not proposing a royal commission here. But clearly this isn't how tax reform should happen. So what should we be doing? This has been very negative so far. So what should we be doing? I think there are very good people in HMRC and HMT who probably are thinking about these things longer term, and there are some really excellent people in think tanks and in universities who are thinking about these issues, but there is a lack of joining up between what's being thought about academically and in the think tanks and what can actually be done. The administration of HMRC really is very important. And one pleasing thing about the current government is that they are very aware of that, and they are putting some money into administration, and they are interested in the way we can improve administration. But at the moment, we have a situation where just to get a form changed takes about a year. You know, we can come up with major ideas about how we could change the whole system, but actually it isn't easy. And if you do put proposals, or if Her Majesty's Treasury are thinking about proposals, they will soon get bogged down in that bureaucracy. So however good they are, and however brilliant the people there are, and however many ideas they have, I think that we do need an outside body to look at tax reform. And the very, very sad thing is that we had an outside body called the Office of Tax Simplification, and that was abolished. It was abolished by Kwasi Kwarteng in his very famous and disastrous budget of 2022. It was one of the very few things that didn't get reversed, because no one really cared about it enough to reverse it. And there were a lot of problems with the Office of Tax Simplification. First of all, its silly name. It shouldn't have been called the Office of Tax Simplification. As David said at the beginning, I was on the board, so I do have an interest. I have to declare an interest, but I wasn't working for it and directly, and I didn't agree with the way it went about things at the beginning. I think there was quite a bit of time wasted by the Office of Tax Simplification on things that weren't important, but it was getting into its stride just before it was abolished, and it produced a really good paper on capital gains tax. And that was quite influential. And I think that's why it was abolished, because it became, while it wasn't really doing anything very important, it was acceptable. But as soon as it began to seem influential, I think it was not anymore acceptable. Politicians don't want outsiders interfering in tax decisions. And I agree that tax is politics. Politics is tax. These are political decisions. But there are also important technical and administrative issues that can be looked at. And if politicians know that they want to do a certain thing, then experts can help them to achieve that in a more efficient way. And I think those experts can be economists who can look at the figures, but they can also be lawyers and accountants and sociologists and a whole range of people who will understand how to collect tax in the least damaging way, to preserve incentives, to retain trust amongst people, and to pluck the goose with the least amount of hissing, as Colbert said. So we really need to have groups of professionals who will do that. Now, there are plenty of people inputting. As I said, there are universities, there are think tanks. The professional bodies do an enormous amount of really good work. But they are all coming from a particular direction, or in the case of the academics, they are really not focused on the practicalities in the way that, and the administrative issues in particular, in the way that the Office of Tax Simplification was. And the other thing the Office of Tax Simplification was able to do was that it could go out and talk to people, and it had a semi-official role, so people would talk to the office, to the members of the office, but they wouldn't feel that they were talking direct to HMT, so they would talk more freely. It was a really good information gathering organization. All of that has been lost. So I'm not suggesting a royal commission that comes in with broad sounding reforms, because I think we have those reforms. We have an array of reforms we could do from the from various organizations. That's not what we need. What we need is an organization that can translate some of those bigger, broader ideas and bring them into the policy discussion with the politicians. And of course, the politicians then have to be open to those discussions. So it has to be done in a sensitive way that will fit in with the politics. And you might think that's the job of HMT, and I think HMT do believe that is their job. But I think that they're under too much pressure and they have too many different roles. They're having to cut expenditure, they're having to bring in revenue, they are having to react to short-term issues, and it really would be helpful to have an outside body to do that. So I would like to see that office reinstated in some way, but with some changes, with a bigger budget and with more independence than it had before. I'm not expecting to see it, because I think it would be seen as a restraint, a constraint on what politicians could do. But sometimes it would be quite helpful for them to have such a constraint, and maybe they will begin to see that it could be helpful, because they are subject to a lot of lobbying, and that lobbying makes life very difficult for the politicians as well. So if we could persuade them that this body could be helpful rather than unhelpful, maybe we could see it reinstated. The other thing I think is that we need to have much better scrutiny in Parliament of taxation. At the moment, we have had many fiscal events, as they call them, many budgets, sometimes 2 in a year. We have been promised just 1 a year, and that's definitely a positive. But why do we have to have one every year? We could have a finance bill which simply authorize the collection of tax, which we have to do annually. It doesn't mean we have to have a bill full of provisions every year. Let's have a rest. Let's have a talk about things. Let's give ourselves time to have a longer talk. And let's also have a committee, not like the Finance Bill committee that we have at the moment, which has to rush through provisions, sits late at night, fits it all around other parliamentary procedures, and doesn't hear from witnesses. Let's have a proper parliamentary select committee that can hear from witnesses, expert witnesses, and really consider tax changes and have longer to do so than it currently does. And the Tax Law Review Committee of the IFS, of which I'm chair, has argued for that or something like that for a very long time. The House of Lords Economics Committee has a subcommittee which does a really good job on 1 or 2 provisions a year. But of course, the House of Lords has limited capacity to intervene in tax affairs. But it would be a good model for a House of Commons committee. So are these changes impossible? Well, I don't think they are, because I don't think things are working now. And I think politicians must be aware of that. The trouble that this latest budget has caused must have given them sleepless nights and distracts them from the really important questions of growth and productivity and so on. Surely they can see that this isn't a sensible way of going about things. And this isn't new. We had George Osborne having to U-turn on the pasty tax. We had Philip Hammond having to U-turn on the what was called the white van man tax. This is not new. And one of the problems is that they are picking on small groups, but vociferous, powerful groups, who then turn on them. So now, with this budget, we've got private school fees, and we've got the agricultural profits relief, and we have farmers marching with pitchforks. It is serious stuff. And I'm not going to comment on whether those are good or bad changes. I think there are justifications for all the changes I've mentioned, but they should have been brought in together with an overview of all VAT exemptions or an overview of the whole of inheritance tax. If we were reforming the whole of inheritance tax, looking at rates, looking at the size of the exemption, looking perhaps at having another rate, not jumping straight to 40%, looking at different ways of organizing our inheritance tax, then we could do something about agricultural property relief, because we could do it in a way which didn't seem as if it was just picking on farmers. It may well be that farmers never should have had that exemption. Why should they have an exemption that other people don't have? But once you've given people an exemption, taking it away is extremely difficult. So you can't just barge in and do that without having a bigger overview, I think, of the whole policy, the whole of capital gains tax, or the whole of inheritance tax. Now, that might sound impossible, but as I've said, if we gave ourselves a bit of time, and we do have a bit of time at the moment, then we could do that, and we could make those changes in a way that, of course, would use up some political capital, but actually we've used up a heck of a lot of political capital, or the government has used up a heck of a lot of its popularity and trust in it for these very small changes, which only bring in about £500 million a year. I mean, tiny amounts. Nothing other than the national insurance brings in an amount that's sizable enough to make a real difference. So why spend all that time and effort and political capital on tiny changes? So let's go for big changes. Let's have an organization that can look at those big changes. Let's give ourselves time to do all those things. And then final point, lobbying. I think there's a lot of lobbying which simply seeks to mystify. And I would just like to mention the private equity people and carried interest here, where we have ended up, after a whole load of fuss on carried interest, with not only some tiny changes that are not going to bring in much money, but also a whole new regime for carried interest, and it's going to become so complex. So we already have a complex system, and there's another layer of complexity going over the top. Why would we do that? We've done that in response to some very effective lobbying. We do need expertise that can help counteract that lobbying, and we need to always bear in mind that adding another regime is probably not the answer. So simplicity should be there in the picture. We should be trying to remove complexity, not add it. in our solutions. So my conclusion is there's a lot of wonderful work going on out there. There's no shortage of ideas. That's not the problem. The problem is how we're using them, how we're drawing them together. We haven't got the processes right. We need better parliamentary processes. We need a body that can look at all these things, not a royal commission, not a body that can dictate to politicians. In the end, it has to be politicians who make the decisions, but a body that can give them serious backing for sensible reform, and they need to give themselves time to think about it. However, I've been saying these things for 30 years now, or maybe longer. I would really like to see a change before I finally retire. And perhaps, if they do make some changes, I will retire. So that's what I wanted to say, and I'm really happy to take questions.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much, Judith. I really appreciate you taking the time to explain all that. I hope they do make some changes, and I hope you do manage to eventually retire. No, I really appreciate you taking the time to read all that. There was an incredible amount of very useful information. So I'll encourage all of the audience members to just type in any questions that they have, and I'll relay them all to what we can to Judith. In the meantime, while some of those are coming through, I'll just discuss some of the ones that I've had as I've been jotting down some notes. And one of the things that struck me, one of the things that I've kind of felt quite annoyed about over time actually is that that kind of analogy with a household budget, if you like, that you mentioned before. And you mentioned it's been happening since 1984. I wasn't around then, but I'll trust your word on that. What do you think has caused that? Because kind of people that understand economics will obviously understand that the government budget is not the same as a household budget. It operates in a very different way, and it allows you to do so many things that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. But what do you think was the cause of that, and what damage do you feel has been done from that?
Well, actually, there was one plank which I didn't cover in my talk, and I meant to cover, and that is tax education. And I think that's something close to the heart of your organisation. So I should say something about that. Because I really don't think that we teach people about tax. I believe people should learn about tax at school, not only if they're studying economics, but simply in civics lessons and so on. But the fact is that we don't teach tax, and most people have very little understanding of taxation. It's boring. They're not interested in it, and it's just something they'd rather not think about. So one problem is that in order to explain tax issues, we tend to dumb down, and politicians dumb down, and politicians probably don't understand it very well themselves in many cases. So it is dumbed down to themselves. They dumb it down to themselves to explain it. We also seem to have got into this cycle of having to justify every new expenditure by saying what the source will be for paying for it, and the idea that if you're going to do something about waiting lists in the NHS, you have to raise the money somewhere specifically, is clearly nonsense. We don't have what we call hypothecated taxes. We don't have taxes that only pay for a certain thing, and they never work anyway. Government has a pot, and then they decide how they're going to divide it up. Why do we have this? I think it's because people think it helps. It's a way of understanding it. It's a bite-sized way of understanding it because it's also complicated. And I suspect that Margaret Thatcher talking about her household budget didn't help all those years ago either, because that probably was the way she saw the nation's budget.
Thank you, appreciate that. Okay, we've got a few questions that have come in now, so I'll start with some of those ones. Someone's mentioned here, has the government broadened the tax base enough? And where is there further scope, and what are the challenges? And I know you mentioned looking at how we deal with this, looking at the future where AI might limit employment and that might limit the tax base from there. Yeah. So is there scope to expand it further?
Well, most economists will say that the best thing to tax is something that's immovable, and that's land. So no, we haven't. We haven't worked out how we want to tax the value of land properly. And one of the problems with the new agricultural property relief reductions is that we don't really seem to have a very good way of valuing agricultural land. So farmers are saying that they're sitting on land that's worth £4 million, but they're only getting profits of 27,000 a year. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. I don't understand that. I still haven't got to the bottom of that. Be grateful if anyone could explain it. But we also have this ridiculous council tax where we have old valuations, and I'm not so bothered about the fact that we have old valuations, because you can simply multiply up from an old valuation. But it is worrying that we do not have any higher bands. So we don't tax those with the most expensive properties enough. We stop at band H, which I think really doesn't go high enough. So that means that those with very expensive properties are not paying very much more council tax than those with moderate properties. And we have to find a way of dealing with that, whilst also recognizing the north-south divide, and that people in the south-east have very expensive properties but also have to live in them and have high mortgages. So it is complicated, but I think we could tax land more and more effectively and more efficiently. So that would be where I would go for broadening the base. The idea that we can collect a lot more from companies because companies are not real people is clearly a nonsense. We've seen from the discussions about national insurance that whilst they might be able to absorb a bit of tax, they will want to continue making profits, and they will want to continue paying their shareholders, and they will only be able to get investments if they can pay dividends to their shareholders. So they will have to find the money from somewhere, and it will come from the, cutting costs in some way, or cutting employees' wages, or putting up prices. There is nowhere one else to pay. So there isn't a magic money tree.
Yeah, and just briefly touching upon something that you mentioned there with regards, kind of slightly related to council tax and the north-south divide. What are your views then on the balance between a kind of central government and local government in terms of tax policy making?
Well, I'm not an expert on devolution. I know that the government is looking at devolved powers and devolved tax collection, but the central problem is that in poorer areas where more expenditure is needed, there are fewer wealthy people to collect tax from. So there will need to be some central redistribution. You cannot do it without that. And we haven't worked out what we're doing with our council tax. So some people's arguments revolve around the idea that council tax is for paying for emptying bins or whatever. And, if you're a single person, you have fewer bins than if you're married. So you should get a discount for the council tax, or things like that. But actually, a great amount of council what the council expenditure goes on social care, for example. So I don't think you can completely devolve those things, because that what they have to pay on social care it becomes a responsibility because of central government decisions. I'm not quite sure how you would do this through the tax system without a lot of redistribution. So there has to be a formula of some kind.
Yeah.
Whatever you do about devolution.
Sure. We've got another question here, kind of related to the idea of joined up government, or the lack of. And this person says, what are we doing for growth? There doesn't seem to be anything in the budget, despite them claiming to be the most business-friendly growth budget ever. And I guess, are there any other crucial areas where you feel that, I know you've mentioned some in your discussion, but you just feel that tax policy is completely disengaged with other government priorities?
Well, on the whole, I think that there are probably usually better instruments than tax for promoting growth. So we should be very careful about always looking to tax to provide the answers. The best thing, and what most business people say, is that if you have a stable tax regime, and they really hate uncertainty, so they don't want lots of changes. So they are quite pleased that we have a corporate tax roadmap, which basically just says we're not changing anything. It doesn't say a lot, but it does say that they're not going to change the corporate tax rate. I think business is pleased about that. They're not going to change the rules on expensing and deductions for investments and so on. So I think business is quite pleased about all of that. Basically, you need to provide a stable tax system, so not change it every year, and certainty, so not have too much complexity. But again, the employment tax area is one where we've both added to the cost, and we have a system where deciding whether someone's employed or self-employed is incredibly complicated, and it's based on old case law and is not being addressed. We have problems with that have been addressed by creating a new system, which is colloquially known as IR35, which causes a lot of trouble and a cost to business, because business has now got a responsibility to decide how to pay a person. And there was nothing in this budget about looking at that and trying to improve on that. So they've said they'll carry on with the R&D system that we have. I think business is pleased about that. It seems to work reasonably well, research and development incentives. But where there isn't some kind of market failure, the best thing is just to have a broad-based low tax, rather than starting to try to second guess for government to be the investor. Government isn't a very good body for deciding who to invest in. So I would say try not to have too many special regimes and special incentives, but just try to provide a good, stable tax system.
Thank you. And another couple of questions here that are slightly related. One of them is about the role of the Treasury Select Committee and Public Accounts Committee. Do you feel that they help or hinder the kind of change that you might want? And looking more at the former Office for Tax Simplification as well, what would make that body effective for tax reforms? What changes would you make to ensure that it would be able to provide the kind of reforms that are necessary?
Okay, well, starting with the Treasury Select Committee and the PAC, their job is not to talk about tax reform. Their job is to look, well, the PAC is meant to be looking at whether HMRC is providing value for money, and whether it's doing its job properly. And the Treasury Select Committee looks at particular issues, but it's not looking at the finance bill provisions. It's not looking at tax reform. So some of the inquiries have been very helpful, but I think particularly the PAC has been very helpful, particularly on the admin side, in keeping up the pressure on government to increase funding for HMRC, which is underfunded and which is trying to engage in a massive transformation to digitalization, which should, in the long run, really improve the way we collect our taxes, but which has not been very quick or easy so far, let's say. And those committees can also look at whether things like whether there are enough prosecutions for fraud, and they can ask questions. I think it's really valuable that someone is asking those questions. But in the end, it will depend on whether government can put enough money into HMRC to do that work. They are putting some money in, but it takes time to train people to do that work as well. So I am concerned about the idea that HMRC has, that it can move away from face-to-face provision of answers and services on the telephone, and that everything can be done online. I think that that's over-optimistic. Perhaps that's due to my age. I know young people like to deal with everything online, but I think our system is so complex that actually it's really hard to deal with everything online. So yeah, I think those committees are good, but it's not their job to talk about tax reform as reform of the tax system. The Office of Tax Simplification, it had a small budget. it had a few employees, but it didn't have a wide range of employees. It had a number of people seconded from HMRC itself, perhaps too many, although you do need some, because you do need to know your way around the organization. And I'm not criticizing any of them. They were very good, but you do need a mix of people. You need good access to data, and sometimes it was hard to get the data because it wasn't always a priority to provide the data, and sometimes the way data is collected is not ideal. And you need to employ people who are maybe not tax specialists, but as I say, behavioral scientists or people who know how to do survey work. I think some of the surveys were a bit simplistic because they were not done by experts in survey work. There are ways to do survey work. So it needed a bigger budget. It needed to be clearly a bit more independent. It wasn't really independent at all. And the name of it, the Office of Tax Simplification, we kept coming back to, well, this isn't about simplification. This is wider than simplification. You can't design a tax system simply to be simple. You have to design a tax system to do something and then try to make it as simple as you can. So simplification has been embedded now, supposedly, into HMT departments, but that's not covering everything that the Office of Tax Simplification was actually supposed to be doing.
Okay, interesting. I wonder, I don't know if it's something similar to the, I don't know, the way that the OBR works with the clear remit and something.
No, it doesn't have the powers or the independence of the OBR. And I think, ideally, I would love it to do so, but I can't see it getting that much independence because it couldn't decide on what tax policy should be. That has to be the remit of politicians. That's really a very political decision. You can't turn it into an expert decision. Experts can't decide how much we should tax or how we should tax. They can only advise. So it couldn't, and the Office of Budget Responsibility also doesn't decide on policy, but I think it has an independence which would be very difficult to give a tax policy body. And so I wouldn't even ask for it, because if we ask for it, we won't get it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, thank you. Okay, slightly different question. How reliable is the data on the tax gap?
I think the HMRC works very hard to make it as reliable as possible, but one of the problems is the definition of the tax gap. What do you mean by the tax gap? So it's made up of lots of different elements, and those elements may vary in their reliability. So it may be quite easy to find out some parts of it where people have been prosecuted. It's less easy to say how much fraud is going on that's undetected. Obviously, by definition, you don't know about it. It's less easy. Also, some people would like the tax gap to be much wider in its inclusivity, to include amounts that they would like to see collected, but under the current system are not being collected, particularly on the international scene. So we may have multinational companies shifting profits from one country to another, not paying in the UK, but paying elsewhere, or not paying at all because they shift their profits to a low tax country. Now, that's not, if they can do that and they can do that legally, that's not a tax gap. That's not a tax gap because they've done it legally. So the tax gap can only tell you about what's legally should be being collected and what isn't being collected under our current rules. It can't tell you what you might like to collect if the laws were completely different.
Okay, thank you. I'll go with another couple of questions here that are related. One person would like to know how you would go about explaining some of these concepts like marginal rates and fiscal drag to the general public. And kind of going at a slightly deeper level, this person has stated that where tax education does exist, it's quite prescribed and technical, and those are important aspects, but they're finding it they're finding a significant reduction in critical thinking for students that will be in the workforce eventually. Do you have any thoughts or advice on how educational establishments can kind of strengthen conceptual, sorry, and critical thinking around tax to avoid some of these risks that we
Is that
face?
a question coming from someone who's studying tax, or is that a they
I'm
know?
not sure, but
I
that
mean, I'm
person
not
can
quite
feel
sure
free.
where the question coming from exactly. I don't know how tax is taught to people. Is tax taught to people doing economics A level? I'm not sure. But yes, if it's made very technical, it feels very dull, and they may not really understand it. So, I've had years of experience of teaching these concepts, and people don't find them straightforward, and it's hard for the teacher who, once they've worked out what it means, to really understand why people don't understand it. So I think examples are very, very important in getting people to talk about cases and scenarios. I do think people understand fiscal drag pretty well now because they're experiencing it. So much of what is being collected to fill this so-called hole is actually being collected via fiscal drag, not through any of these changes I've mentioned today. And when it hits you and you suddenly go into the higher rate or have to start paying tax when before you weren't paying tax, even though you don't feel any better off, you know all about fiscal drag. So I think when people experience it, they certainly understand it. Um, uh, they are marginal rates, I think, do really confuse people, but it shouldn't be that hard to explain them. So it's about having good materials. I think actually the HMRC does have some materials. HMT and HMRC do have some materials online that they've developed, which might be helpful. Having scenarios, starting to think about it in terms of your own life. So, I mean, I remember desperately trying to explain tax to my own children and them not being the slightest bit interested. They were my children after all. But then when one of them started to run a business, or a tiny business selling books, or selling T-shirts or something, and they suddenly realized it was quite important, and came running to me and wanted it explained. So and that was the Young Entrepreneurs Scheme or something. I can't remember what it was called. So I think if you do schemes at school like that, you can build the tax teaching into those schemes. It's probably best not to have a class called a tax class, but to build it into your other classes.
Thank you. And probably the last question as we're approaching 8 o'clock now. What would you respond to the argument that the IR35 system seems to be causing more problems to the employee, who is often asked to sign an agreement that includes an indemnity in favour of the employer?
I think the IR35 system has become unduly complex and is being the fact that the responsibility has been moved onto the employer now means that it's becoming too inclusive. So more people are being included in IR35 than I think should be. And there are some proposals for changing umbrella companies, which I think are good, but which are also going to make life more difficult for individuals probably. Now, I think those individuals very often probably should be being taxed as employees. So I don't think they should be paying less tax than people who are employees. And my answer to all of this would be a radical simplification and bringing the tax that's paid by employees and the self-employed, including the national insurance, much closer together, so that the difference wasn't so important, and then it wouldn't matter so much. But that will not be a popular answer with many people who consider themselves to be self-employed.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you. I guess just to wrap up, a lot of ideas to be fair, that have been discussed in this discussion here. If there was to be one thing that you could choose out of the things that you've mentioned already and talked about already, and potentially even researched outside of this discussion, that you feel would make the kind of biggest tangible impact on tax policy in terms of its improvement. Would you be able to identify what that one thing would be?
Well, I mean, it would have to be the process, improving the process, because if I pick out any, personally, I would like to see IR35, the whole area of employment status sorted out, and that because that's what I have personally worked on for many, many years. But of course, it doesn't affect everybody. But I do think it would save costs for business, decrease friction for and worry for many individuals, and create a much fairer tax system. So I'd like to see that change, but of course that doesn't touch the sides of many of the things that need to be done. So my answer would have to be better institutions.
Okay, amazing. Well, thank you very much. Judith Freedman, I really appreciate you taking the time to explain all of that and engage in such an insightful discussion that we've had this evening. Just before we go, I'd just like to inform everybody of the next event that we have, which will be next week on the 19th of November. We'll be joined by Professor Paul Cheshire, and he'll be discussing how planning and housing influence economic growth. You can sign up for that on our website now. But once again, thank you very much for your time this evening, Judith, and thank you very much for everybody who's attended as well. I really appreciate you seeing you today.
Thank you for inviting me and for listening. Thank you. Bye.